Welcome back to the Ghost Bunny podcast. I'm your host, Bridget Marcourt, with a brand new episode for you. My guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Yuko. Dr. Yuko is an award-winning journalist and bioethicist and an adjunct professor of ethics at Fordham University. She has been published in Rolling Stone, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, CNN, the History Channel, Teen Vogue, Playboy, Architectural Digest, The Wall Street Journal, City Lab, Dwell, Health, Reader's Digest, CNBC, Miss Magazine, and Vulture, among others. Yuko has also appeared on the Travel Channel shows Mysteries at the Museum and Beyond the Unknown, discussing the history of medical quackery and Blood Falls, Antarctica. And she gave a TEDx talk on bioethics and the Golden Girls. She regularly gives talks and presentations on various history topics at venues including the Morbid Anatomy Museum, RIP, the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Cincinnati, the Lloyd Library and Museum in Cincinnati, and the Juliette Gordon Low Birthplace and Museum in Savannah. I've been dying to talk to her, and especially for this time of year, and you're about to find out why, and it's finally time. Elizabeth, thank you so much for doing the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So, I think you already know, but just for the listeners, I really want to do a fun Christmas episode. And one of the things that I'm kind of obsessed with are Victorian ghost stories and why they used to be kind of a Christmas tradition and they are no longer a Christmas tradition. I wish they were. Maybe I'll start making them a part of my Christmas tradition. But I started doing a little bit of research online to try and figure this out or find some of these ghost stories. And I found an article that Dr. Elizabeth Yuko wrote. And I was like, oh, I have to contact her and find out what she knows about this and everything. And when we started talking about this, all of a sudden, all these other topics came up that would be great for the show. So we're going to try and get to all of it today. And it might even be an extended episode. So we'll just see how it goes.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. So first of all, I just have to say, I love the show Mysteries at the Museum.
It was fun.
I'm obsessed with it. I found a list the other day, just I think it was on Yahoo or something like that, where it had all of these things, these artifacts from history that are on display places. And it was so fascinating to see some of the things, just weird things, all the contents of Abraham Lincoln's pocket when he died. They have that. And the boot that John Wilkes was wearing. Just all this weird history. Houdini's straitjacket and everything. These things are all on display somewhere. The VW bug that Ted Bundy used is on display at a crime museum. Just all of these crazy artifacts from history in all different places in history. I did not realize that Martin Luther King Jr., the hotel room he was staying in, has been left completely intact and untouched since that day. And that you can go to the museum and see in the room. I had no idea.
Wow. It's amazing what literal pieces of history that we have left and the different stories that these objects can tell. And the connection that you can feel with it. I haven't been in contact with Houdini's straitjacket, but I did a fellowship at a library last year, and they have a book from his personal collection in their library. So it has the book plate, belonging to Harry Houdini. And it's a book, I believe, on spiritualism. And I just was looking at it and I can't believe Harry Houdini held this book and is reading about the same topic that I came to the library to read about today. It's amazing.
Yeah. I just love all of that. And you did an episode on that show about Blood Falls in Antarctica. And that is so cool looking. And I think to the average person just looking at it, so for those that don't know, or maybe I should let you describe it. It's like a red waterfall, right? In the snow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it looks like blood. It's not. It's different metals that make that color. But if you were to be somewhere where most things are white and just see this what looks like a gushing blood river, it would be pretty startling. And so, yeah, they did that. I don't have a personal connection to Blood Falls, so to be totally honest, I don't know why they asked me to do that particular episode. was like, sure, okay, why not? I did another one for them on a medical quackery device, and that's more in line with my background. That was interesting. And then I did another one related to Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. But I'm not sure that one ever aired because I think there was some controversy regarding whether or not that was an appropriate topic for the show. But we filmed it anyway.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of more like in your genre and everything, tell everybody what bioethics is.
Sure. Basically, bioethics deals with the unanswered questions in medicine and research. So it's, when someone gets sick, you go to the doctor, the hospital, you hopefully get a treatment and get better. That's not really controversial in most cases. That's kind of just medicine as it is practiced. But in some cases, treatments aren't on the market yet. They are still in either the research and development phase or experimentation phase. You would never have a patient taking a treatment that's not at least in the experimental phase. But maybe the doctor says, okay, do you want to be part of this clinical trial? Like, let's say you have a type of cancer, and here are the risks. You might have these other side effects you might not have had otherwise, but here are the benefits. You could get better. And so weighing the risks and benefits is really one of the keys of bioethics, and making sure that research is being done ethically. So any human subjects are protected, and the research is protecting their right to autonomy and agency and not exploiting them for any reason. Also, public health. We learned a lot about this during the pandemic when we were asked to maybe give up some of our individual rights and freedoms for the greater good. So things like wearing a mask falls under that category. So people might not have liked wearing, probably nobody really likes wearing masks, except for when it's cold and it's nice, it covers your nose. But we were being asked to do that to keep other people healthy, or taking the vaccine. And so, yeah, it's all of the issues that don't have a clear-cut answer, and that you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah. And you wrote an article for Playboy. Tell me about that.
I wrote a few articles for Playboy, actually. For a few years, I worked with an editor that I loved. One was on how Elaine from Seinfeld had a refreshingly progressive take on the female orgasm. And so even though it was a show about men, written primarily by men, which I think probably had something to do with it, they basically wrote her as a guy. And so her sexual pleasure was important in a way that women's sexual pleasure really wasn't. It was the punchline, like, can't find the G-spot, or women are so hard to make orgasm. And outside of those contexts, it wasn't like something that came up a lot. So that was one. I think my last article for them was on Playboy and Hef's role in furthering the abortion debate, whether that was funding amicus briefs in court cases before Roe, and basically what Playboy had done as an organization and a magazine to further that debate. And the headline was, "We can't go back." Unfortunately, we have gone back since then, with the Dobbs decision and Roe being overturned. What else? I wrote one on cigars and whether or not their popularity was fizzling out, or they burning out. One on the golden record that was sent to space in the 70s. So it was kind of all over the place. It was, I forgot, my favorite one was actually for the heritage section, and it was looking at Playboy's predictions of the future. So I went back in the archives and I read a bunch of issues from the 50s and 60s primarily, and a few from the 70s, and looked at articles and pictorials that showed what Playboy thought the future would look like. So whether it was these automatic homes, the ultimate bachelor pad, what women would be like in the future. And I kind of put together what Playboy predicted versus what actually came to be. So it was fun.
Yeah, that's like, it is all over the place, that's for sure. But I thought it was just so funny because I feel like that kind of, overlaps us a little bit.
Yeah, I know. It was fun.
Yeah, and then I saw your article on history.com about the Victorian ghost stories, and that's what made me reach out to you. But before we even get into that, because I feel like the Victorian ghost stories are going to be a great way to like cap this whole episode off and finish it
Sure.
with like spooky stories. But I wanted to ask you first, like we were talking when we were talking about all of that, we were also talking about Victorian mourning and spiritualism and things like that. So let's get into that a little bit because I am absolutely fascinated with spiritualism. I'm also interested in I'm interested in the whole thing, but I just love how it was so female dominated back then. And I feel like spiritualism and connecting with the other side and having that kind of like connection and everything has always been very female led, except now. I feel like, and
Yeah.
it's not that it isn't in the real world, but the way it's perceived on television and, in the press and everything, it's a very man's world. And I've talked about that a lot on here and everything, but I feel like you're the perfect person to go into that a little bit deeper and kind of the history of all of that.
Sure.
So you guys know how much I love the holidays, and I love cooking, and I love baking, and I love all the prep for it. But sometimes it gets a little stressful. And HelloFresh makes mealtime manageable, saving you from searching for recipes and all that grocery shopping. You just pick your meals, and everything you need is delivered right to your door. And it's so helpful this time of year because I want to be planning my holiday meals and doing all my holiday baking, and I don't want to be worried about what's for dinner all the time. Every HelloFresh recipe includes high-quality, sustainably sourced ingredients like produce that comes fresh from the farm. And there's always something for everyone to enjoy on HelloFresh's weekly menu because if you guys know me, you know I'm a very particular eater with 50 chef-crafted recipes to choose from every week, plus customizable options to make your meals just the way you like them, which is what I need big time. You'll be able to easily satisfy every craving and everybody at your dinner table. You can save valuable time during the busy holiday season with fewer trips to the grocery store thanks to HelloFresh Market. That's right, a market. There's over 100 add-on items you can add to your weekly box, like quick breakfasts, packaged snacks, and beverages, and so much more. And if you're traveling for the holidays or just too busy to cook at home, you can easily just skip the week's delivery if you need to. And I love that part about it because I never know when I'll just be flying off to New York for Christmas like this year. Get 10 free meals at HelloFresh.com/free-ghost-bunny. Applied across 7 boxes, new subscribers only, varies by plan. That's 10 free HelloFresh meals. Just go to HelloFresh.com/free-ghost-bunny. HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit.
So I think you've mentioned in a previous episode the idea of the separate spheres in Victorian times, the idea that women had a sphere and men had a sphere, and women's sphere is the home, and the home is a woman's domain, her kingdom. She controls how clean it is, the food that's being served, how children are raised. And then men's domain is literally anywhere else ever. So everything was kind of separate in terms of, women weren't permitted in most cases to speak out in public, having an audience, because, why would you listen to a woman to begin with? That's a waste of time. She probably doesn't know what she's talking about. So this was kind of the atmosphere that spiritualism kind of sprang up in. And the kind of founders of spiritualism are people who are usually credited to the Fox sisters, who were young girls who were said to communicate with a dead peddler in their house. And it's that itself was a very long story and ultimately a sad one because they both died kind of penniless and without family. And they, at least one of them, recanted the story at one point, but then went back on that. And there was potentially some coercion involved in that. But so basically spiritualism, the idea that we can communicate with the dead, was started by women. And because of this kind of separate spheres ideology, men were seen as public, as aggressive, as antagonists. And women were seen as emotional, as passive, as sensitive. And turns out that those are the characteristics that supposedly make women better mediums. And that at least was the idea of the time, that women are inherently better at being able to communicate with people who are living and also the dead. And so as spiritualism spread, the Fox sisters were from upstate New York, and really upstate New York was the hub of a lot of these new religious movements in the mid 19th century, including Mormonism, the Oneida community. The Shakers were from England, but they set up shop in upstate New York as well. And so you had these churches essentially organizing these spiritual communities, and women often were the leaders of these communities, which itself was a huge, huge deal. The fact that women were allowed to lead something and lead it in public was unreal. And so when you have one of the most famous, probably the most famous spiritualist community is Lilly Dale, New York, which is just outside of Buffalo. It was founded a little bit later on, I think the 1879-ish, I think. A woman was one of the major founders of the community. And what was really special about Lilly Dale is that they had a giant amphitheater. It still exists. You could go today. And women were given a literal platform to discuss ideas and to speak out in public. And that was seen as dangerous because why, if we're given a voice, then we might try to convince people that we should be allowed out in public or to have rights or, God forbid, to vote. And maybe this might upend the whole women must stay at home ideology. And so Lilly Dale also, there was a lot of overlap between spiritualists and abolitionists and suffragists. So even if people weren't themselves practicing spiritualists, they were often invited to speak at Lilly Dale to have a venue for giving their public presentations. This was a case for people like Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw, and other prominent suffragists. So that was, in Seneca Falls, where the women's convention was in 1848, is not too far away. So it's all kind of in the same general area. But yeah, and the other kind of piece of this is that sometimes one of the ways women who were mediums showed their skills was, whether in public or private, speaking as somebody else. So you might have a young woman who's a medium who says, okay, Benjamin Franklin's coming through. And so she then I don't want to use quotes, but she then speaks as Benjamin Franklin. And of course, more than 100 years later, I can't say what was true and what wasn't. But when she was speaking as Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln or whoever it was, she was not only allowed to speak in public, but people were listening to her. So I don't know, if I lived at that time and I had some message that I wanted to convey to people, I'm not saying I would have been a fraud spiritualist, but that was a way to have an audience and have people listen to your ideas. So you weren't allowed to speak as a woman, but you were allowed to use your voice to speak as Benjamin Franklin, or George Washington or whoever it was, or just even a guy from your town who had passed away. So these were some of the ways that spiritualism literally gave women a voice.
So some of the records, and some of the, I've taken a lot of parapsychology classes and things like that. And some of the records from the messages that the women were getting and writing, they were writing in different languages that they had never learned before. They were talking about policies and philosophies that they were never allowed to even learn about or hear about. So some of it is pretty compelling evidence that a lot of these women were getting messages from something somewhere else.
Yes. No, I don't mean to shit on that's probably a bad terminology, but I don't mean to say that nobody was legitimate, but because it's hard to tell now so many years later. But you're absolutely right. You did have, especially younger girls who, would never have had the opportunity to learn these things, are all of a sudden writing or saying things or drawing or painting things that were inspired by an encounter that they had with somebody on the other side. So I'm not judging that. That was kind of just more of another way that they were potentially able to speak.
It's just so fascinating when you see all of that, because I definitely agree. There probably were definitely fraudsters out there. I mean, in every field still
Oh
today,
yeah.
there are fraudsters out there and everything. So there definitely is that going on. But I just have read some things that are like so interesting and so compelling, and even to this day seem to stand up. It's so fascinating to me, people that are able to do that, because a lot of these women who were doing it were also uneducated. So some of them couldn't even like read and write in their own in their own language. So to be able to write like these crazy philosophies and stuff from somebody who is gone, and men looking at it going, wait, no, this is exactly what he said, and this was exactly how he would have said it, and those kinds of things. I just feel like, gosh, there's so much behind this, and I wish that we were able to somehow prove this. To me, it's proof in a way, but like I wish that we were able to like look at that as a society and be like, no, there's definitely something here, and we need to like research this more and take this more seriously. Whereas I feel like it's kind of more, oh, that's a little woo woo is the word they like to use, and it's too weird and too out there and can't be proven and those things.
For sure. And I had the opportunity to go to Lilly Dale. I just stayed for 24 hours. I had to be in Buffalo for work. And so I was like, oh, if I tack on one day, I can just drive over there. And the way everything is presented there is just so matter of fact. And nobody's trying to convert you. Nobody's trying to convince you of this. It's just, that's what life is like there. And experiences with mediums are just spoken about because, you get to know people who are also there. You have lunch and dinner together, and someone will say, oh yeah, I just had an appointment with a medium and my mother came through, and this medium told me something that there's absolutely no possible way that she could have known without something. Like, there had to be some type of explanation, and it just to be surrounded by that even for 24 hours was so interesting. And they do have a museum and a library there, and I didn't have a chance to really spend a lot of time in either one, unfortunately, but I definitely want to go back and spend more time there because they just have so much in the way of who was there, not just speaking, but also visiting. I know Mae West made a few trips there, and I think they actually have a Mae West Day every year where they have something in her honor. And
That's so fun.
it is. I think she was there for the opening of a healing temple, and so it might be in conjunction with that. But yeah, I mean, you just are surrounded by evidence and things that they've collected over the years, and so it's really powerful being there.
I've always wanted to go to Lilly Dale, and I'm curious, did you have a reading while you were there?
I didn't. You have to schedule them in advance, and I didn't
Ah,
really have time. And I don't. So I was there 1 month before my mother died, and so I was meant, and it was not a surprise. She had cancer. We knew. We didn't know it was going to be that soon, but we knew it was going to be in the next several months. And so mentally, I was on this side of death, spending a lot of time with somebody who was very clearly about to die. And so I don't know. I kind of felt like, "Oh, it's terrible. Like, I'll come back later when she's not here, maybe." So, you know what I mean? Like, it was because I have had plenty of people close to me die, but not a parent. She was my first parent. So it was comforting being there at that time in my life because you were just surrounded by people who weren't afraid of death and who spoke about it in a really gentle way. Whereas in the
mm.
cancer hospital, the language that's used is fighting and battling. And I mean, that's the kind of language you have to use to, psych yourself up for a lot of hard treatments and everything. But it was just a totally different mindset that people had about death, and being there so close to my mother's passing was comforting, even, without having the reading experience.
Yeah. Did you do, I know they offer every day, I think it might be even multiple times a day, they do the readings in the amphitheater where you could just go and watch, and they have a medium get up and they address different people in the audience. And I think anybody can go to that.
Yes, that was really interesting. And that's exactly what it was, is everyone sits in this amphitheater and there's a medium who is kind of running the session, and they kind of just walk towards somebody and say, okay, I have someone coming through for you. Or they'll say, okay, the person coming through is wearing brown pants and a yellow sweater vest. He's older. He has glasses. So like maybe they'll physically describe the person or give like a feeling about them. So I got to experience that, which was really interesting. I also did one of they call it a ghost tour or a haunted tour, and some people showed up with like paranormal investigating equipment, but it definitely wasn't that type of tour. And I felt kind of bad. They'd come a long way to do that. And the tour guide was kind of said, that's not what we're doing. This is more of a historical tour at night. And, it's not saying you're not going to capture something, but, it was fascinating though to hear, because he had lived there his entire life, and just to hear what it was like growing up there and hear his own stories, and as well as the history of the community itself. And because it's so small, you could easily cover it in a 2-hour walking tour. And what was also really unique, I think, about Lilly Dale is I'm not the bravest person in the world. I'm much braver actually since my mother died, because I watched her die. And I think after going through that, like, I don't know, I guess one of the things I was afraid of was watching a person die. So when you do it, you're like, okay, I did that. So I'm a little bit braver now, but I would not be the type of person to venture by myself in the woods. And they have, there's a lot of kind of woods surrounding Lilly Dale, and they have an inspiration stump, and they have like a pet cemetery and things that are located in the woods. And normally I would have been a little apprehensive about, and just like as a woman by myself, typically don't like mill around in the woods alone. But I just felt so calm there. And like,
Yeah.
it was really strange. I don't remember feeling like that before, but just peaceful, and like nothing was going to hurt me. I saw a few other people who were on my tour, but that was it. And I just remember feeling like, oh, okay, this is good energy, or I don't know. So whatever it was unusual for me. So something is special there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's something you said, and I'm curious, maybe you know the answer to it. You said that this man that was giving the tour had lived there his whole life. For some reason, I was under the impression that Lilly Dale was just sort of open during the summer months, and then they kind of close it down. Is it open year round? Can you go there year round?
Visitors can't go year round, but people live there year round. So some people only spend the summers there. To the public.
Got it.
I think their season is maybe June to September or something like that. And at that point, anyone can come. You just drive up. There's a gate fee. I think it was like $15 or $20. I can't remember exactly. And then once you pay the gate fee and you're on the property, then most of what they have is free to attend: the healing ceremonies, the group medium readings, the tours. So you just kind of show up to what you want to show up to. The medium, if you have a reading individually, you do pay for that. And like food and the accommodation and that type of thing. And I didn't stay in the hotel, but they have, a really old hotel that's been the hotel there since the 1800s. And I did go in the lobby, and there was a sign that says no seances in the lobby of the hotel, which was not something I had ever encountered before in my travels. So that was really, really interesting. And they had a few paintings in the lobby that people had done while, that was, somebody coming through when they were the spirit paintings. So that was interesting. Also, I stayed in a room in someone's home. They kind of Airbnb them out, but pre-Airbnb.
Yeah, I heard that they did that, and I don't know why, but that's the part that kind of creeps me out the most. Like, I would definitely be in the hotel.
For me, it was air conditioning. That's why I didn't stay in the hotel. The hotel didn't have air conditioning, but people's houses had them. So, and this was August. It was so hot, and I was like, I just need some, just need some air. But yeah, next time I definitely want to stay in the hotel.
It's interesting because you brought up the paintings that were in the lobby of the hotel where it shows experiences that people have during a seance, right? Of like ectoplasm or something of those sorts. And I had on my previous podcast that I used to do, I had on a woman named Shannon Taggart, and she did a whole book. She's like the Lilly Dale or a Lilly Dale photographer, and she photographs during seances, and she captures all kinds of crazy images. And she says that she does do things to like make the exposure extra long and things like that. But she like captures like weird light coming out of people and strange, like what look like anomalies on their face. And she did a whole book on this stuff, and it's called Seance. And it was very interesting, the stuff that she's captured.
Ooh, her name does sound familiar. I'm still on the Lilly Dale like newsletter mailing list. So they'll have, even though they're not open during the summer, during the rest of the year, they do have Zoom classes you could attend. So you could attend classes on kind of honing your intuition skills or connecting with a spirit guide or something like that. So that is year round. And I think they've had some events with her that have looked really interesting.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating because, I mean, ectoplasm is pretty controversial. I don't know how I feel about that. And, you know, when we talk about fraudsters and things like that, that kind of stuff was definitely going on in the Victorian era with like seances, with like people being caught, like pulling like cotton or like weird things out of their mouth or other areas that we don't need to talk about. And they were hiding it and bringing it out and calling it ectoplasm. So I'm really on the fence about ectoplasm, but I do feel like there could be something there, even if it's like a light or, you know, something that is happening that we can't explain, you know, physical stuff.
Yeah, it is tricky kind of, because and when you get into ectoplasm, you kind of also, it's similar to postmortem photography and spirit photography, and a lot of that was exposed, not a pun, to be like double exposures and stuff like that. So everything kind of gets a little messy.
Yeah, but let's talk about that for a little bit, because I love the whole Victorian mourning stuff and the spirit photography. I mean, I feel like I don't know of an actual photograph during the spirit photography days that's been proven or hasn't been debunked. Like, I feel like they all are like, this was definitely double exposure, or this was somebody actually standing behind the person. They sneak out from behind a curtain and pose and things like that. So I don't know if any of I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't done like a ton of research on it or anything, but I haven't like found or heard about a photograph where like, this is the holy grail of proof that sometimes spirit photography was real.
I haven't heard either. I mean, I've definitely seen examples of like post-mortem photography where it's somebody who's deceased in a picture, whether it's them by themselves or being propped up, or even propped up with their eyelids closed with eyes drawn on their eyelids to make it look like they're not, you know, that stuff. There's examples of that. And I was speaking with a antique photography expert once, and they said probably one of the easiest ways to tell is that, you know, and at that time you had to be completely still when you sat for photos. Otherwise, you know, if you move even a little bit, the photo can get blurry. But one of the benefits of taking pictures of the dead is that they don't move. And so he said, sometimes we'll be looking at an old picture and there'll be somebody who is completely still and a perfectly clear picture, where everybody else in the picture is a little bit blurry, or, you know, something's a little off. And they'll say that's one of the ways that they tell, is that they come out the clearest.
That's fascinating. I know. So postmortem photography, that for sure, just for the listeners, I know you already know, but that for sure was like a thing that people did back in the day. And it was, just taking pictures after people died, because sometimes that would be the last time, or I mean, it would be the last time, but like sometimes that'd be the only photo that you ever had of that person. But it's interesting the way they would do it, because sometimes they are in a coffin and, dead or looking like they're asleep. But other times, like you said, they are propped up and they're in like a family photograph. And especially with children, and they're propped up sitting, and sometimes they have their doll next to them. And sometimes it's really difficult to tell whether the person is dead or not, but they are. And that was the whole point of taking the photo. I've even seen pictures of a man standing one time, and the things that they had to do to prop him to be standing. He was leaning against a bar, but he was standing, and supposedly he's dead in that photo. So it's crazy the things they did. Yeah.
And you're right, especially with children. Sometimes that was the only photo that they had of a child, especially because photography was expensive. And so that might have, a family might not have ever had an opportunity to take a picture either as a family or of their child. And so that might be the only picture they have of them.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. My brother actually is the one who got me interested in all of that. He has books that have just like tons of photos of the post-mortem photos in there. And it's so interesting to look at them and read the history and who they were and, what they died from, and like just like revisit all that. It's so fascinating to me, and definitely not a tradition that people keep up today that I know of.
Well, it's not exactly the same, not propping people up, but I guess I decide whether or not it continues with me and my generation. But my mother and my grandparents did take photos of the deceased, but in a coffin. So in an atmosphere you would expect to find someone. But my grandparents were immigrants, and a lot of their family stayed back in Europe, and that was a way to demonstrate that somebody was really dead. So you might take a picture if it was a little bit later on, or hire a photographer to take a picture that would then serve as evidence that somebody is actually deceased. Or sending a lock of hair might also have worked. But as long as I remember, my mother always took pictures inside coffins. And so I grew up with that. It got creepier as I got older, because once I realized what I was looking at, I was like, wait a minute. And then it happened a few times where I wasn't expecting. I lived abroad for a few years, and my grandparents both died while I was away, and I didn't get a chance to attend either of their funerals. And one day I'm just innocently looking through pictures, and there's my grandpa's corpse, there's my grandma's, and my mother was like, oops, forgot to warn you, those are in there. So if you ever wondered what she looked like before we buried her, there she is. Like, oh, great. So I guess at that point I was the family member in Europe. But and when my mother died, my cousin, she said, okay, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to carry on this tradition. And so she took a picture of my mother in her coffin, which was kind of, and we were not sending it to anyone for proof, but it was more of like a joke to lighten the mood, which I guess is something on my family's idea of a joke, taking pictures of a corpse. But it was always my mother, the thing that she would always do that nobody else really felt comfortable doing. And so my cousin was like, all right, step it up for our generation, I'm gonna do it. So yeah, but going through old boxes at my parents' house, you don't know if you're gonna come across photos of corpses, locks of hair, teeth, all these things that were saved from people who had died.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking a photo of somebody who has passed away in their coffin or otherwise, and especially if the person was okay with that and that was part of their tradition and everything. But what I don't think exists anymore is us, or that I know of, is propping them up and putting them in a family photo, or like doing things that make it look like maybe they were still alive here, but they didn't. What?
I mean, no, we definitely did not do that. We didn't prop anybody up. I did, because she was really she gave me a long list of things to do. And one of the things I was in charge of was her lipstick. And she was like, you have to make sure it's a shade that flatters my face and that they don't put too much on. It's not on my teeth and all this stuff. And so I almost like put a little tube of her lipstick in there and took a picture. But I was like, that might be going a little bit too far. Like, because the person who my joke was with was the one dead. So I was like, this is only funny to one living person right now. So maybe not. But, but yeah, no one was propped up.
Yeah, I like that though. I like that idea. You brought up the whole thing about hair earlier, and I want to talk about that too and how important that was in the Victorian times and saving a lock, and sometimes putting it in like a brooch or making hair art with it and things like that.
Yeah, that was that tradition started a little bit before the Victorian times, but like ghost stories that we'll talk about later for Christmas, it really kind of picked up at that time. And Queen Victoria had a lock of her husband's hair after he died, and that also kind of popularized this idea. And so, yeah, sometimes it would be as simple as cutting off a piece and putting it in a clear locket, or like an actual locket for a lock of hair. Some people are very skilled at working with hair and can weave hair into necklaces, earrings, bracelets, a watch. Blanking on what it's called, but it attaches your pocket watch to your pants. That also was done. You need a lot of hair for stuff like that, though. And so it was used a lot for mourning, but it wasn't always for mourning, because let's say you are a woman and your boyfriend has to go away to war or do something, you might cut some of your hair off and weave something and send it with him as well. But for mourning customs, there are different types of art or jewelry you can make with hair, which I only know this. I took a class on Victorian hair work through the Museum of Morbid Anatomy, which is here it used to be a physical location. Now they have, I think, a small physical location, but you could take a lot of classes online. And so I did this during COVID, and you learned how to do, it's called gimp work, which is an interesting name. And that's when you wrap hair around a piece of wire, and then you take the hair wrapped wires, and you could turn that into a wreath, into flowers, and put that in like a shadow box or some type of frame with a like bubble on the front. A lot of times people had family wreaths where it wasn't just one person's hair, it was multiple generations of hair in one wreath. I think there is one of those in the front parlor at the Lizzie Borden house. I want to say that's where there's one with multiple generations in it. And those are interesting because you could see different colors of hair, different stages of life, and they're not all necessarily dead person's hair. Sometimes, I mean, some of it is, but you know, it's an interesting way. And I do have I have some of my mother's hair, and not from when she actually died because she didn't have hair at that point, but I found some in a box from when she was younger. And so I might try to do something like that. My skills are admittedly not amazing, because it's really hard. Most of what I've done is palette work, which is basically taking hair and laying it down flat on a piece of wax or vellum paper, and then cutting shapes out of the hair that's dried flat with like Mod Podge on top, or just using Mod Podge and making the hair into the shape of, I usually do weeping willows because it's the easiest, and it's a very classic Victorian death imagery. So that's my go-to. One of the reasons I had taken the class, in addition to just being interested in it, was that I lost a lot of hair during COVID, from having COVID, not just from existing during it. And I mean, there were times when it was just coming out in clumps. I had 3 pretty substantial bald patches. And at one point I was sitting there and like predictably crying after I like pulled out this giant clump. And I was like, wait a minute, I will make lemonade out of these lemons. Let me learn how to do Victorian hair work and then make hair art out of my hair that I've lost from COVID. So that's what I ended up doing. And it was appropriate because I have long COVID, and so I never recovered from having it the first time. I got sick in March 2020 here in New York, and I'm not the same person as I was before. I don't have the same abilities. My health is not the same. It probably never will be. And so I was and still am mourning the person who I was in early March 2020, who I will never be again. And so the feeling kind of behind making this art, and as you're putting it together, you're thinking of the person who is no longer here, and it's a good way to remember them. And not that I was sitting there thinking of myself. That sounds bizarrely self-centered, but I mean, for me, it was more of a distraction and a way to process all the emotions I was going through. But it was kind of in the same vein of being an outlet that it was for people in Victorian times. And not surprisingly, hair work was women's work. It was something that women sometimes were trained to do, but it was also something you could outsource. So there were women who had businesses where you could give them hair that belonged to your family members, and they could make a wreath, or they could make a locket, or some of the jewelry is really like they use teeny tiny curling irons or hair tools to make these really beautiful designs. And so that became, I mean, mourning in Victoria times it was an entire industry in terms, like, you had mourning attire. So you had the specific clothes. I think you talked about that in a previous episode of the different colors you were allowed to wear at different stages of mourning. So that was a business and industry. Hair work was another business and industry. And so, yeah, people not made a living in a bad way necessarily, but death was big business at that time. And so, yeah, you could, especially for women, it was a job you could also take in on the side and not, work in a hair factory, which I don't even know if such a thing existed. But, you could do that type of work for people in your neighborhood and maybe earn some money. And maybe for a woman that meant having a degree of independence she wouldn't have had otherwise. So I like to think of that side of things too, that it wasn't just a custom for remembering people, but it also, gave women a way to earn some money. And, unfortunately money is power. So that maybe gave them opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Teeth, also not just in my family, especially if children died, their teeth might have been made into jewelry for their mothers, either maybe a brooch or a necklace or something along those lines. The Victorians had a very different mentality around death than we do today.
Yeah. And they also used to cover the mirrors, right? With like a black cloth.
Yes. Covered mirrors. When someone was dying and then dead, everything took place in the home. Like, people really didn't die in hospitals the way, the hospitals didn't exist. People absolutely died in them. But now it's kind of taken for granted that you die in a hospital or hospice, if you know that someone is going to pass, that you're going to die at home. And so in middle and upper class Victorian homes, there might be a dedicated sick room. And so this room was really for, it was usually small, easy to clean, had a single bed, an open window, because ventilation and sunlight were very important. It's where women gave birth. It's where they recovered from childbirth. It's where people who were sick or injured stayed, where people convalesced. It's also where people died. And so that's when you had like these deathbed scenes or people attending a deathbed. You usually were gathered in the sick room of a house, or if there was no sick room, then in the person's bedroom around their bedside. And there were household manuals that described what the sick room should look like, how to prepare one for someone who's about to pass, things like covering your mirrors, because then after someone did pass, if you had a wake, it was usually in a house rather than going to a funeral parlor. That came that came as a result of this, but most people were laid out from in their own homes. And so, yeah, there were and women were certainly in charge of anything to do with the household. So that was another piece of women's work, was making the house appropriately cleaned and decorated. And it might not be the woman of the house if she's mourning a child, or her husband. It might be a neighbor, it might be a sister or a friend, but you were going to find a woman somewhere kind of orchestrating everything around the deceased.
It's so fascinating that you got to take this hair art class. I would love to take something like that. Like, I think it's fascinating that you did it. And I think it's fascinating that exists, that that's something that people can do.
The teacher is amazing. Karen Bachman is her name. I think she still teaches. I'll look it up and send you a link. She's worked for Tiffany's. She is like a legit jeweler, but who also has extensive knowledge of Victorian jewelry and Victorian hair art. And it was absolutely fascinating. Even if you don't, because part of class is a lecture, and then part of class, it was all on Zoom because of the pandemic. But, you're working on stuff, and she could see you and give you tips and stuff like that. So it was a little bit of both, but it was absolutely fascinating. And we touched on a lot of these topics during that. Another thing I wanted to mention that was really big was the Victorian concept of the good death. That was, there were a lot of different Victorian ideals that, women had to live up to, or men had to live up to. And the good death was also something people aspired to have. And that looked a certain way. People, loved ones gather around your bedside. Maybe the person who's dying is forgiving people, or making last confessions, or just saying things from the heart that they hadn't had a chance to say before. One kind of guidebook I read on preparing a home for someone dying, one of their tips was to keep some paper and a pen nearby so you could write down the person's last words, because last words were so important. And that's survived in pop culture and regular culture, really, because what was the person's last words? And that they were thought to either be extremely meaningful, that we think that if someone is very close to death, that maybe they might be able to impart wisdom on us that the rest of us just aren't privy to. And so, a person's last words in the Victorian ideal would be something extremely meaningful, something very wise, or it might offer some type of glimpse of what the afterlife looks like if they were still kind of transitioning, or however, whatever the proper terminology is, that people also hoped to maybe hear what it was like the bright white light, or whatever. So a lot of what we think of as kind of cliches are from this time. And this idea of the good death was also comforting. It was comforting to the people who were there, not just at that time, but also as they were perpetuating this idea. It was comforting to them moving forward, because when someone dies, it reminds us we're going to die too. And so it's comforting to know that, there's this ritual that happens. And a lot of times it really was a ritual. It wasn't, because we know that everyone wants to die peacefully in their sleep, and we want our loved ones to die peacefully. That's the ideal, but that doesn't always happen. And so they had to have ways around that. And so one of those ways was, having this ritual, kind of like today we say, I'm so sorry for your loss, or my condolences. We don't know what to say. Those words, it could be, we're uncomfortable. We don't know how to console people. That's what comes out. And they had similar scripts of things that they said in terms of, asking for forgiveness, getting last pieces of wisdom. And then if someone was not dying peacefully, which is frequently the case because it's real life, that was seen as them being purified and getting ready to go to heaven. So if you saw any type of movements or fluids or anything else that might happen that doesn't fit in with the, perfectly peaceful person sleeping in their bed like this with their head on a pillow, then that's explained as, oh, they're getting ready to enter heaven. This is kind of their last purification. So they had an explanation for basically everything as a way to work through it and comfort people, because death was just so much more present with infant mortality, maternal mortality, really also. It was the Industrial Revolution. People were dying in industrial accidents and factories. This was when tuberculosis was rampant, cholera. So there was just a lot of death. So these were kind of coping mechanisms that society had. And we could definitely see vestiges of that have survived still today.
Yes. If somebody wanted to go to Lilly Dale, like say they were visiting New York City and they wanted to go to Lilly Dale, is that something you can do on that trip, or is it too far?
That's too far. So I can't remember how many hours. It's 5 or 6 hours maybe from New York, I think. I flew back from Buffalo. So I drove
Yeah.
from New York, and it took a few days because I was making a bunch of stops, and drove that way, and then ended up flying back because it's all the way kind of on the other side of the state. But if you're in kind of the Buffalo or Erie, PA area on that side, you could definitely hit that up. But I'm biased because I live here, but there's so much fascinating history in New York State, upstate. And the tourism board actually they have a lot of information, but they have a haunted history trail where they have an interactive map that they put together with a bunch of haunted history destinations, places that do paranormal investigations, places that do more historical tours. So you could definitely make your way from New York City to Lilly Dale, stopping at some of those locations on the way, which I did. So yeah, it's it's more of a commitment, but yeah, if you're coming from the West Coast, then might as well.
Right. I just feel like that would be so much fun to like do a whole, like fly to New York and then do like a whole like road trip tour and go up to Lilly Dale and back. I feel like that would be such an awesome trip, which kind of leads me into our next topic of haunted tourism, because you did a whole article on that.
I did, yes. Really inspired by my own travels, because just as a journalist, I ask a lot of questions, even if I'm not writing an article. And one thing I like to notice patterns to see, if 3 things are a trend, or something that, if there's something I could either write about or investigate further. And I am interested. Well, I'm interested in a lot of things, but I will visit any type of old hospital, facility, anything like that. And I noticed that a lot of them had these either tours at night, ghost tours, paranormal investigations. And at one point, one of the people at one of these museums made a comment like, just ignore that. Don't pretend you didn't see that. I was like, oh, pretend I didn't see that you're having a paranormal tour tonight? It's like, what if I wanted to go? And she was like, it's just, I would rather we didn't have events like that, but we need them to keep the lights on. And I found that was not necessarily that attitude, but financially, that a lot of historical sites are able to stay open and keep the lights on and keep them heated year round, or keep them, maybe not, you're not going to take a prison that's falling down and renovate it, but you do need to make sure, if you're having people come in, that it's structurally stable, that things aren't going to fall on people's heads, and do at least some type of minimum. And that a lot of times that money comes in not through funding, because it's really hard to get funding, but through these haunted tours and ghost tours. And sometimes the month of October will sustain a historic site for the rest of the year. That's how important it is for a lot of people. And so I was interested as an ethicist in what people thought as far as what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, because a lot of the places where you do have, people coming and interested in ghosts or paranormal activity are places where there was a lot of suffering. So hospitals, prisons, that type of place. And so I interviewed historic preservationists, people of tourism boards, people who work at these different sites. And it really ranged from like the one person who wasn't super enthusiastic about it, but said it was necessary, to other people being very enthusiastic about it and saying, like, we don't really care why you're interested in our site. We're just happy people want to come. And if they want to come and investigate at night, great, that's fantastic. And I'll also kind of mention that a lot of times there is overlap between people who will come during the day for historic tour and people who will come at night for paranormal tour, but that's not always the case. And so they'll reach new audiences and bring new people in who might not have come otherwise. And if there's one kind of haunted attraction in an area, it could really create an entire tourism area that didn't exist before. So Mansfield, Ohio is an example of this that I looked into in the article. They have the Ohio State Reformatory, which was the Shawshank prison. And so that is, you could do all sorts of tours there. They have no problem talking about the benefits of having the paranormal investigations and ghost tours there, because they probably wouldn't be open otherwise. But after that started to attract tourists to the area, then you had a theater that was supposedly haunted also offering tours, or a historic home maybe doing the same thing. So you could kind of create this, like they did in New York, like a haunted trail of attractions. And people might not necessarily be going to Mansfield, Ohio otherwise. And there's examples like this all over the country where you have historic sites that are able to stay open because of that, and then also draw tourists based on that and other haunted attractions that spring up around them.
Absolutely, because I went to Mansfield Reformatory. I was not trying to go to Mansfield at all. I was going to Cleveland for a Halloween convention, and the Ohio State Reformatory invited me to come. And so we drove, like, I don't know, I think it was like an hour and a half from Cleveland, or hour or something like that. And in the middle of the night, my boyfriend and I were out there like doing a ghost tour with their PR person and a security guard, just us in the middle of the night, the whole prison. It was incredible.
Oh my God. I've been too scared to do it. I'm originally from Cleveland, so I actually do have, reasons to be in that area. But yeah, I would definitely go during the day though. That would be interesting. But yeah, it was their tourism people, both for the prison and for the city itself, were really helpful for the article and really gave some great insight into the benefit that it has.
Yeah, they are so welcoming there, and they really, really, they, like you said, they do history tours. So if you just are only interested in the history part, they have that, but they do all kinds of paranormal tours. They do like paranormal lockdowns overnight type of tour, or like investigations. And they also then do like a haunted attraction, like, at Halloween time, like a made up haunted attraction thing.
Oh yes, that's kind of another category. I forgot about that, where they'll use a historic building and make a not fake haunted house, but like an attraction where people jump out at you, and it's not a real ghost, it's a teenager from the local high school in a mask. But they'll create something like that.
Right.
I think Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky had something like that. I don't know if they still do, but I did a historic tour of the hospital, and they still had some of the decorations up. And so you were going through the kind of the ruins of this hospital, and all of a sudden you'd see a severed hand on a gurney, and they'd be like, "Oh, just ignore that. That's plastic. That's from the night. that's from the night tours." And I'd be like, "Oh my God, I thought that was real." Or they'll have like a strategically placed wheelchair or something that like normally wouldn't go there, but it yeah, during the day I had a lot of questions, and the answers to almost all my questions were like, that was from the nighttime, ignore that. Yeah, they weren't, because I contacted them for the article as well. They were not as keen to talk about the nighttime, the haunted attraction. So yeah, I don't have much insight, but
Really?
yeah, it was Yeah, it just didn't seem to be something that they just didn't feel like discussing it.
That's so weird to me because I would say Waverly Hills comes up so often, almost in every one of my podcasts, and it's either like one of the scariest places or the place where somebody got the most like evidence or kind of weird things happening, or it's the number one place that paranormal investigators want to go. So it just seems like that is the number one reason anybody even goes there. I'm so shocked that they don't recognize that or want to talk about
They
that.
Yeah, they did recognize it. So I guess I'm the anomaly, and I have studied and written a lot about tuberculosis. And as a tuberculosis hospital, it was absolutely state of the art when it opened. And you probably remember from the tour, they have those giant balconies where you could wheel the whole bed outside. They had individual built-in radios for every patient, and for the people who went there as patients, this was kind of like their big hope that maybe they'll get better if they go there. And at least the tour guide I had was really hammering home that point, that like we want this to be seen as a place of hope, and where a lot of people died, but some people got better, and didn't necessarily want it to be associated with death and stuff. But also, I mean, I went on the historical tour, and part of it was showing the body shoot. So like death's inescapable at somewhere like that. So yeah, it was
Right.
interesting,
Yeah.
but I mean, a fascinating place to visit, I'm sure, any time of day.
I want to go so bad. I've never been and I'm dying to go.
I mean, I don't know what else you would do in that area.
Right? That's why I haven't been yet, because it's like a thing you specifically have to go there for that. But I think Louisville isn't far away from there, right? It's really close to Louisville.
Yeah, that's the closest main city. So I think if you're there for horse racing or anything, and my sister lives in Cincinnati, and so I think it's like 2 hours from Cincinnati. So I drove down while I was visiting her once.
Yeah. I read something, I think it was in one of your articles. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that when we had spiritualism back in the day, it was there was a lot of it going on too because of the Civil War and all the death that was going on. But in more modern times, because like for me when I was younger, I had an experience very young, so I've always been into the paranormal, but it wasn't really a thing. And I've talked about it before that when I had my experience, my family was very like weirded out by it because ghosts wasn't something that anybody ever thought about or talked about in our family, and there wasn't TV shows on about it or anything like that yet. But then later in life, like TV shows start happening and more people are talking about it, and now it's like so common, like so many people are into it and involved, and there's, like you said, all these ghost tours and paranormal investigations and everything. But I read somewhere recently, and I think it was your thing, that said that 9/11 kind of inspired this sort of new wave of ghost fascination and trying to talk to the other side and communicate with people we've lost so tragically.
Yes, I think it was in the Haunted Tourism article. And I'm blanking on the name of the scholar who first said that in her research. I think it was a woman. But yeah, that basically we see spiritualism increase in popularity anytime there was, yeah, a massive amount of deaths. So after the Civil War, it was really popular. There was another bump after the 1918 flu pandemic, which also coincided with World War One, and that kind of after that, it really, except for a few communities, really wasn't that prominent. But then after, yeah, the massive loss of life, and that combined with the trauma, because even if you didn't personally lose someone in 9/11, it was just a massive event that caused collective trauma for the country. We were looking for ways to heal. We were looking for answers. And that after that is when we started seeing all of the ghost hunter shows, the different franchises on the different channels popping up. And that really has lasted 20 more than 20 years at this point. Like it hasn't really gone away. And I was really curious to see if the pandemic, the recent pandemic, would have a similar effect, because we don't like to think about it now because, that was not a great time, but also, people didn't want to wear masks and all that. But more than 1 million Americans died. That's a crazy, staggering number, that so many people died, that I thought maybe there would be more of an interest in, if not traditional spiritualism, just haunted tourism or ghost encounters. I don't know if there's been a direct correlation like that, or if it's too early to tell. But yeah, you're right. That was somebody's hypothesis, that after 9/11 we saw that spike, and that's just never gone away. But when you think about it, after 9/11, that was also around the time when Columbine was 2 years before that. And really since then, it's just been school shooting after school shooting. And so we're going through collective trauma and collective grief of kind of event after event after event. So it would make sense that we are drawn to tourism, TV shows, books, podcasts that touch on these topics.
Definitely. Well, I have another topic and our Victorian ghost stories, but I think that we should end it here for this week and pick up the next topic and the Victorian ghost stories for next week's episode.
Sounds good.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and your stories with us. Do you want to share your social media handles or any way for people to contact you or follow you online?
Sure. My website is just myname.com. So Elizabeth Yuko, YUKO.com. I'm at Elizabeth Yuko on Instagram, not so much on Twitter anymore, but that I am Elizabethics. So ELIZABETHICS. So my name plus ethics. Those are the main ways.
Awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Ghost Bunny podcast. Thank you so much for joining me on my spooky adventures, and I look forward to sharing a new ghost story with you each week. Please subscribe to our podcast so you're always the first to know when a new episode is out, and follow us on social media at Ghost Bunny Podcast on Instagram for photos and sneak peeks, and at Ghost Bunny Podcast on YouTube for the video version of the podcast. And join us next week for Victorian ghost stories. I'm so excited for them. Woo! Bye, guys.